Dorothy Watkins hadn't heard her son Marcus's voice in 27 years. Not a call, not a letter, not a single word. When she walked onto the Family Feud stage in Columbus, Ohio, on a Tuesday afternoon, and smiled at Steve Harvey like everything was fine. She'd rehearsed that smile in her hotel mirror the night before. She'd practiced the laugh. She'd told herself the same thing she'd told herself every morning since 1997, just get through today. But when Steve asked her, during a casual pre-game conversation that was supposed to last maybe 90 seconds, "What's the one thing you wish you could change about your life?" Dorothy Watkins stopped smiling. Her chin dropped, and 27 years of silence came flooding out of a 71-year-old woman right there on national television. Steve Harvey didn't move. He stood completely still. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, set it on the podium in front of her, and said 4 words. "Call him. Right now." It was a Tuesday in September 2022, and the Family Feud studio in Atlanta was doing what it always did on a taping day, filling up with noise and energy, and the low hum of cameras warming up. Dorothy had come down from Columbus with her sister Bernadette, her niece Tamika, her neighbor Cora, and Cora's teenage daughter. They'd worn matching purple shirts that said Team Watkins across the chest. They'd been excited in the green room. Bernadette had laughed so hard at one of the warm-up comedian's jokes that she'd nearly spilled her water. Dorothy had laughed too. She was good at laughing. Steve Harvey came out to the stage the way he always does, big, warm, filling the room with a presence that immediately made the audience relax. He went through the families, asked quick questions, did the thing he does where he makes everyone feel like they're the most interesting person he's ever met. He got to Dorothy and asked where she was from, what she did, what she loved. Dorothy said Columbus. Retired school teacher, loved her grandchildren. But nobody in that studio knew what Dorothy was carrying behind that purple shirt and that practiced smile. Dorothy Watkins had not heard her son Marcus's voice since he was 24 years old. The fight, the one that started everything, had been about money and old wounds and things that never got properly said in a family that didn't know how to say hard things. Marcus had packed his car and driven to Seattle in the spring of 1997. And 2 weeks later, he'd changed his number. Dorothy had written him 4 letters over the first year. None came back. None were answered. She'd found a Seattle address once through a mutual friend and sent a birthday card. It came back unopened with return to sender, handwritten in ink she didn't recognize as her son's. She'd wondered every day since whether he'd written those words himself or asked someone else to do it. Because even that small detail mattered. Even that told her something about whether he'd seen her name on the envelope or just thrown it away without looking. 27 years is a long time to carry a silence. Dorothy had retired from teaching 6th grade after 34 years in Columbus public schools. She had 4 grandchildren she loved with everything she had. She had Bernadette and Sunday dinners, and a garden in the backyard where she grew tomatoes every summer. She had a life, a real one. But every Mother's Day for 27 years, she'd sat in her kitchen after church and listened to the other women at her table talk about calls they'd gotten from their children. And she'd nodded and smiled and said, "That's so sweet," and then excused herself to do the dishes alone so nobody would see her face. She'd stopped looking for Marcus after year 11. A pastor she trusted had told her she had to release it to God. She'd tried. Some days she thought she'd succeeded. And then she'd see a man in a parking lot walking the way Marcus used to walk, that particular way he had of moving with his chin slightly up, and the 27 years would collapse into about 4 seconds, and she'd be standing in her kitchen in 1997 again, watching his car pull out of the driveway. Her granddaughter Amara, who was 9 years old at the time Dorothy applied for Family Feud, had found her crying once in the garden at dusk. Amara had stood very still and then said, in the quiet way that 9-year-olds say terrible truths, "Grandma, do you have a son that went away?" Dorothy had nearly fallen over. She'd never told the grandchildren about Marcus. She'd nodded. Amara had taken her hand and said, "I think he probably misses you too." And that was the real reason Dorothy Watkins applied to Family Feud. Not for the money. She was fine with the money. She had a pension and a paid-off house. She'd applied because she needed to do something big and bright and public. Something that made her feel alive and not like a woman who was slowly becoming defined by a silence she hadn't chosen. But what she said next would change everything, and not in the way she had expected. When Steve Harvey asked her the question, simple, casual, part of the warm-up, "What's the one thing you wish you could change about your life?" Dorothy had prepared a joke answer. She'd planned to say, "I wish I'd taken better care of my feet." Because this stage is a lot of standing. She'd even practiced it. But when Steve looked at her with those eyes that somehow managed to be funny and genuinely warm at the same time, Dorothy Watkins opened her mouth and said something she had never said on purpose to another human being outside of her sister and her pastor. She said, "I haven't spoken to my son in 27 years. And I don't know if he's alive." The studio fell completely silent. Not the pause between a question and a laugh. Not the quiet before an applause cue. A different kind of silence entirely. The kind that happens when 300 people all realize at the same moment that something real just broke open. Steve Harvey's smile disappeared. His hands, which had been moving the way they always move when he's in the rhythm of the show, went still. He looked at Dorothy for a long moment. The cameras kept rolling because nobody told them to stop. "Tell me his name," Steve said. "Marcus," Dorothy said. "Marcus Watkins. He'll be 51 in February." Steve didn't say anything for another moment. The audience hadn't moved. A woman in the second row had her hand over her mouth. "Do you have a number for him?" Dorothy shook her head slowly. "I have an old email address. I don't know if it still works. I wrote him last year. Never got a response. I don't know if he got it." Steve reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone. He set it on the podium in front of Dorothy, and he looked at her and said, "Call him. Right now." Dorothy stared at the phone. "Steve, I don't have his number." "I told you, we're going to find it," Steve said. "My team is going to find it right now, and you're going to call your son in front of every person in this room and every person watching at home. Because I need you to call him. Because I know what it is to think you've lost somebody forever. And I know what it is when one phone call changes the whole story." He turned away from her and spoke directly to his producer off stage. "Stop everything. I need a researcher on a phone right now. Finding a Marcus Watkins, age 51. Last known location, Seattle, Washington. Last known contact, 1997, go, A stage manager, visibly startled, reached for her headset. A producer on the far side of the stage was already on her phone. The audience, all 300 of them, sat absolutely still. Even the crew, hardened television professionals who had seen everything, had put down what they were doing and were simply watching. Steve walked back to Dorothy. He sat down on the edge of the stage, right in front of her podium, not caring about his expensive suit, not caring that the floor was dusty from the taping. "Let me tell you something," he said, "and I want the audience to hear this too, because this isn't a Family Feud moment right now. This is a human moment." He paused. "In 1985, I was living in my 1976 Ford Tempo. showering in gas station bathrooms, eating out of trash cans behind restaurants on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland. I didn't talk to my family for almost 3 years. Not because they did anything wrong. Because I was ashamed. Because I didn't know how to call somebody and say I'm not okay and I don't know how to get okay and I need you. I didn't know how to do that. And those 3 years, those years of silence, they almost killed me. He looked at Dorothy. I don't know why Marcus stopped calling. But I know what silence does to a person when it goes on long enough. It makes the phone feel heavier and heavier until you can't lift it anymore. Sometimes what somebody needs is for the other person to lift it for them. Dorothy had both hands over her mouth. Her sister Bernadette, 3 feet away, was crying openly. 2 members of the opposing family, the Chambers family from Memphis, had crossed the stage without being asked. One of them, a woman named Joyce, had her hand on Dorothy's shoulder. 7 minutes after Steve Harvey gave the order, a researcher appeared at the edge of the stage and handed a producer a piece of paper. The producer walked it to Steve. Steve looked at it. He looked at Dorothy. I have a number, he said. I can't guarantee it's him. But it's a Marcus Watkins, 51, in Tacoma, Washington. Do you want to try? Dorothy Watkins looked like she might stop breathing. She nodded. Steve dialed. He put the phone on speaker and held it out between them. The studio was so quiet that the ringing was audible to the entire audience. It rang 3 times. Then someone picked up. Hello? Dorothy made a sound that wasn't a word. It was just air leaving her body. Because she knew the voice. She'd been hearing it in her sleep for 27 years. Lower than she remembered. Slower. But it was him, Marcus. She whispered, Baby, it's Mama. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted 4 seconds. The longest 4 seconds in the history of that studio. Then Marcus Watkins said, Mama? And Dorothy Watkins collapsed into Steve Harvey's arms, and the studio fell apart. 300 people. Not one of them was quiet. A boom operator in the back corner of the studio turned away from the room and stood with his face in his hands. Joyce, from the Memphis family, was holding Bernadette. Steve Harvey, who had the phone in one hand and Dorothy in the other, was crying and not trying to stop. He held the phone up so Marcus could hear the room. All of it, the crying and the applause, and the sound of his mother saying his name over and over. Steve wasn't done. When Dorothy was composed enough to hold the phone herself, Steve stepped back and addressed the camera directly. I want to talk to everyone watching at home, he said. If there is someone in your life you haven't spoken to, and you know who it is, you knew it the second I said that. I need you to hear this. The silence isn't permanent. But time is. Don't let the phone get any heavier than it already is. He turned back to the stage and held up his hand. There was more. Steve called his business manager live on his second phone while the taping was still running. He committed to paying for round-trip airfare for Marcus Watkins from Tacoma to Columbus, plus a hotel. Plus whatever time he needed to make it work. The audience heard every word. Then he announced that both families, Team Watkins and the Chambers family, were receiving the full prize package, because, as Steve put it, today, everybody wins. The Chambers family from Memphis didn't hesitate. Their captain, a man named Derek, walked across the stage and shook Dorothy's hand and said, Ma'am, this is the best television I've ever been on. 6 weeks after the taping, the episode aired. Within 48 hours, the clip of Dorothy's phone call had been viewed over 140 million times. The hashtag #CallHimMama trended in 14 countries. Thousands of people posted videos of themselves making calls to estranged family members, parents, children, siblings, friends. The clip was covered by outlets in 22 countries. 3 months after that day, Marcus Watkins flew to Columbus for the first time in 27 years. Dorothy made his favorite meal, baked chicken, macaroni and cheese, green beans with smoked turkey, the same meal she'd made for him every Sunday when he was a boy. They sat at her kitchen table for 6 hours. They said things that had been waiting 27 years to be said. It wasn't easy. None of it was easy. But it was real, and it was theirs. A year after the taping, the Marcus and Dorothy Watkins Family Reconciliation Fund was established through Steve Harvey's foundation. Its motto, taken directly from what Dorothy said backstage after the phone call, was, "It's never too late to pick up the phone." In its first year, the fund provided free family counseling and mediation services to over 400 estranged families across 8 states. Today, Dorothy Watkins has a new contact in her phone. It's listed simply as Marcus, my son. She calls him every Sunday after church. He answers every time. Steve Harvey, in an interview nearly a year after the episode aired, said this: "People ask me what the most important thing I've ever done on that stage is. I'm going to tell you. It wasn't a game I called. It was a phone I dialed. Because that woman came in carrying 27 years of silence, and she left carrying a conversation. That's the most important thing I've ever done on that stage." Dorothy still grows tomatoes in her backyard in Columbus every summer. And every Mother's Day now, when the women at her table talk about calls they've gotten from their children, Dorothy smiles, a real one. The kind she doesn't have to practice, and says, "Mine called me yesterday." Some silences end, not because time heals them, because someone finally picks up the phone. If this story about a mother's 27-year silence and the 4 words that ended it moved, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to know that it is never too late to find your way back to the people you love. Have you ever been estranged from someone and found your way back? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more moments that remind you what family truly means. Because as Dorothy and Marcus proved, love does not have an expiration date.